In the spring of 1932, in western Kansas, the land lay like a stubborn old mule under a sky that had forgotten how to cry. And every farmer within 50 miles believed the same thing. Survival belonged to those who could outrun hardship with bigger machines. Steel had become a kind of religion, tractors roaring across the plains like iron sermons, promising speed, scale, and salvation. Yet, on a modest 120-acre plot at the edge of Ellis County, a farmer named Samuel Carter stood beside a pair of workhorses, his hands wrapped not around a steering wheel, but around worn leather reins, quietly choosing a path that made no sense to anyone watching. While neighbors mortgaged their futures for the latest machinery, Samuel refused every offer, every salesman's pitch, every whispered warning that he would be left behind. He believed something different, something older, something almost invisible in a world rushing toward noise and speed, that the land, like a living thing, remembered how it was treated. Samuel's farm was small by Kansas standards, but it was measured not only in acres but in patience. Each season unfolded with a rhythm that machines could not mimic. In summer, when wheat prices hovered around $0.40 per bushel and desperation pressed against every decision, tractors tore through fields in clouds of dust, churning the topsoil into submission. Samuel, by contrast, moved slowly. His horses stepped carefully, their weight lighter, their impact gentler, leaving the soil structure intact. Neighbors laughed openly, leaning against polished tractors, calling him outdated, stubborn, even foolish. They calculated efficiency in acres per hour. He measured it in seasons per generation. The symbol of his defiance sat in the corner of his barn, an old wooden plow, its handles smoothed by years of use, its blade sharpened by hand. To others, it was a relic. To Samuel, it was a conversation with the earth, a tool that demanded attention instead of speed. Each furrow he carved carried intention. Each turn of soil guided by sight, touch, and memory rather than horsepower. He knew which patches held moisture longer, which slopes lost nutrients fastest, and which corners of his land needed rest instead of pressure. While tractors flattened difference into uniformity, Samuel leaned into variation, treating his farm not as a factory but as a system of small, interlocking truths. By the fall of 1934, the Dust Bowl had begun tightening its grip, winds rising like invisible walls, lifting soil into the sky and carrying entire harvests away before they could be gathered. Farmers who had chased speed found their fields exposed, their soil loosened beyond recovery, their investments buried under layers of debt. Samuel's land did not escape the drought, but it endured it differently. The slower methods, the lighter touch, the refusal to overwork the soil had left behind something rare: structure, resilience, a quiet resistance to collapse. His yields were not spectacular, but they were steady when steadiness had become a form of wealth. Still, the ridicule did not fade. If anything, it sharpened. By 1936, when wheat prices dipped again and machinery became even more aggressive in both size and cost, neighbors began to treat Samuel not just as outdated but as an obstacle, a reminder that their own choices might carry consequences. They pointed to his smaller harvests, his slower pace, his refusal to expand. They spoke of progress as if it were inevitable, as if resistance were the same as failure. And yet, quietly, Samuel continued to refine his approach. He rotated crops with precision, leaving sections of land fallow to rebuild nutrients, introducing legumes to fix nitrogen naturally, reducing his dependence on external inputs long before the term sustainability existed. There was one object that followed him through every season, something small enough to be overlooked yet constant enough to matter. A simple brass pocket watch, scratched and dull, ticking steadily against his chest. While others raced against time, Samuel seemed to carry it differently, as if he were not chasing it but negotiating with it. He timed his planting not by calendar dates alone, but by soil temperature, wind patterns, and the behavior of insects. The watch became less about hours and more about intervals, about knowing when to wait and when to act. As the decade turned toward the 1940s, a question began to settle over the county like dust on a windowsill, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. If speed and machinery were truly the only path forward, why were so many of those who embraced them sinking deeper into debt, while one man, working slower and smaller, remained standing? And more unsettling still, what would happen if his quiet defiance was not backward at all, but ahead of its time? By 1942, Samuel Carter's name had become a kind of quiet contradiction whispered across grain elevators and county fairs, a man who seemed frozen in time, yet somehow untouched by the financial storms that battered everyone else. While others upgraded to larger tractors, some costing over $1,200 and financed through risky loans, Samuel still relied on his two horses, now older but trained with a precision that bordered on instinct. His acreage had grown modestly to 180 acres, not through aggressive expansion but through careful acquisition of land that others were forced to sell under pressure. Each purchase was deliberate, often involving fields that had been overworked and stripped of vitality, land that machines had exhausted and abandoned. The early 1940s brought shifting fortunes. War in Europe began to reshape global demand, and crop prices responded with unpredictable swings. Wheat climbed past 1.0s per bushel, offering a sudden surge of opportunity, but it came with volatility that punished those who were overextended. Many farmers, already burdened by equipment debt, pushed their land harder, chasing short-term gains. Samuel did the opposite. He reduced planting density in certain plots, sacrificing immediate yield for long-term recovery, a decision that baffled even those who had begun to respect him. It looked once again like he was leaving money on the table. But beneath the surface, Samuel was building something far more intricate than a single season's profit. His farm operated like a living ledger, where inputs and outputs were balanced not just financially but biologically. He tracked soil health through texture and color, adjusting his methods based on observation rather than instruction manuals. Instead of purchasing expensive fertilizers, he relied on crop rotation patterns that restored nitrogen naturally. Instead of maximizing every inch of land, he allowed certain sections to rest, creating a patchwork of productivity that shifted year by year. The wooden plow, once a symbol of stubborn resistance, began to take on a different meaning. Younger farmers, curious and quietly skeptical, started visiting his land, watching how he worked, asking questions they would never admit to asking in public. They noticed the absence of deep erosion lines, the way moisture lingered longer in his soil after rain, the subtle but undeniable difference in plant health. Samuel never lectured, he demonstrated. Each furrow was an explanation, each season a lesson written in dirt instead of words. By 1947, his operation had reached 240 acres, and something unusual had begun to emerge: consistency. While neighboring farms experienced dramatic swings in output, Samuel's yields remained stable within a narrow range, rarely the highest, never the lowest, but always reliable. That reliability translated into something more powerful than peak performance. It meant predictable income, manageable risk, and the ability to make decisions without panic. In a decade defined by uncertainty, Samuel had quietly engineered stability. The brass pocket watch remained a constant presence, its steady ticking echoing the philosophy that guided every choice. Time for Samuel was not an enemy to outrun, but a resource to align with. He delayed planting by days when conditions felt wrong, even if forecasts suggested urgency. He harvested later when moisture levels demanded patience. These small adjustments, invisible in isolation, compounded over years into a system that seemed almost immune to the chaos around it. Still, skepticism lingered. By the early 1950s, agriculture had entered a new phase of mechanization, with tractors becoming faster, larger, and more efficient. Chemical fertilizers and pesticides promised even greater yields, and the pressure to adopt these innovations intensified. Samuel, now in his 50s, faced a new wave of doubt, not just from neighbors, but from a changing industry that viewed his methods as obsolete. The question returned, sharper than before, pressing against every assumption. Could a system built on patience and restraint survive in a world accelerating toward maximum output at any cost? By 1956, the wind across Ellis County carried a different sound, less of horseshoes on soil and more of engines cutting through the air, a metallic rhythm that signaled a new era settling in whether anyone welcomed it or not. Samuel Carter's farm, now stretching across 310 acres, stood like a quiet island in that current, still guided by reins, still shaped by hands rather than horsepower, but the pressure was no longer just social or financial, it had become structural. Grain buyers began favoring volume contracts, machinery dealers offered incentives that felt almost impossible to ignore, and extension agents spoke in numbers that made Samuel's method seem inefficient on paper. Efficiency, they argued, was no longer optional. It was survival. Yet Samuel understood something those numbers could not capture. He had spent over 2 decades studying not just crops but consequences, tracing the long arc between decision and outcome. Where others saw yield per acre, he saw cost per mistake. A tractor could cover 20 acres in a day, but it could also compact soil, disrupt microbial life, and create dependencies that multiplied over time. Each shortcut carried a hidden ledger, and Samuel had learned to read it. That year, he made a decision that puzzled even the few who had begun to admire him. Instead of scaling up production to match rising demand, he reduced his wheat acreage by 15% and introduced a more complex rotation system that included clover and alfalfa. On paper, it looked like regression. In practice, it was an investment in resilience. The clover fixed nitrogen, reducing the need for external inputs, while alfalfa improved soil structure and provided an additional revenue stream through livestock feed sales, even though Samuel himself kept only a small herd of 12 cattle primarily to cycle nutrients back into the land. The wooden plow, now repaired countless times, became more than a tool. It was a boundary, a line Samuel refused to cross into blind acceleration. Each time he guided it through the soil, he reinforced a principle that control mattered more than speed. Younger farmers who had once visited out of curiosity now returned with quieter questions, often after experiencing their own setbacks. They spoke of rising maintenance costs, unpredictable chemical results, and yields that climbed quickly but fell just as fast. Samuel listened more than he spoke, but when he did, he pointed not to theories but to patterns, seasons layered upon seasons, choices stacked over years. By 1961, something unexpected began to surface in the local market. Buyers noticed that Samuel's grain, while not the largest in quantity, was consistently higher in quality, with better protein content and more uniform kernels. It fetched slightly higher prices, sometimes 5 to 10% above average, a margin that compounded over time. While others chased volume to compensate for falling margins, Samuel quietly improved value. It was a different game entirely, one that rewarded precision instead of expansion. The brass pocket watch remained at the center of his routine, its ticking now almost ceremonial. He would pause before each major decision, holding it in his palm, not to check the hour but to remind himself that time properly used could turn small advantages into unshakable positions. Years earlier, it had helped him survive. Now it was beginning to help him outpace. Still, the world outside his farm was accelerating faster than ever. By the mid-1960s, tractors had become not just common but dominant, and the gap between Samuel's methods and mainstream agriculture widened into something almost philosophical. Neighbors no longer mocked him as loudly, but they also no longer understood him. He was no longer behind or ahead in any obvious sense. He was simply different, operating under a logic that did not fit the prevailing model. And beneath that difference, a tension began to build. Subtle but unavoidable, as if the system Samuel had spent decades refining was about to face a test not of efficiency or profit, but of survival itself. By 1968, the test that had been gathering at the edges of Samuel Carter's life finally stepped into the center, not as a single event, but as a convergence of pressures that no amount of patience alone could fully absorb. A stretch of erratic seasons began to unsettle even the most stable operations. Spring rains arrived late, then all at once, flooding low fields before vanishing into long, punishing dry spells. Wheat prices, once buoyed by steady demand, began to fluctuate sharply, dipping below 120.20 per bushel at times, rising unpredictably, then falling again before farmers could adjust. For those dependent on machinery and external inputs, the cost structure became a tightening vise. Fuel prices crept upward, maintenance bills multiplied, and debt payments remained fixed regardless of yield. Samuel's system, built on restraint, did not collapse, but it did strain. His diversified rotation cushioned the worst of the volatility, yet even he could not fully escape the economic gravity pulling at the entire region. That year, his total yield dropped by nearly 18%, a rare deviation from the narrow stability he had maintained for decades. It was enough to unsettle the quiet confidence that had defined his approach. For the first time in years, he stood in his barn longer than usual, the wooden plow resting against the wall, the horses shifting gently in their stalls, as if waiting for a decision he had not yet made. What made the moment heavier was not just the numbers, but the alternatives. By now, tractors were no longer experimental or elite, they were standard. Financing options had become more accessible, and even cautious farmers began to see them not as risks but as necessities. A single mid-sized tractor could replace days of manual labor, cover more ground, and potentially recover lost yield faster. The argument was no longer about ideology. It was about survival under changing conditions. Neighbors who had once mocked Samuel now approached him differently, not with ridicule but with a kind of reluctant concern. Some suggested he adopt a hybrid approach, keeping his principles but incorporating machinery where it made sense. Others were more direct, warning that the margins were shrinking too quickly for any system to remain untouched. They pointed to their own operations, larger, faster, still profitable, despite the volatility. From the outside, their argument carried weight. Samuel listened, as he always did, but this time the silence that followed their advice stretched longer. He walked his fields with a slower step, stopping more often, kneeling to feel the soil, watching how water settled after rain, how roots held or loosened under pressure. The brass pocket watch remained in his hand more frequently, its ticking no longer just a rhythm but a question, measuring not hours but uncertainty. For decades, he had trusted that time, properly aligned with, would reward patience. Now he had to ask whether time itself had changed the rules. In the fall of that year, instead of making a visible shift, Samuel did something almost invisible. He adjusted his system at a level few could see. He began experimenting with narrower planting rows in certain sections, increasing plant density without increasing total acreage. He altered the timing of his rotations, compressing some cycles while extending others, effectively redistributing risk across seasons rather than concentrating it within a single harvest. He also began tracking his inputs and outputs with greater precision, not on paper ledgers alone, but in patterns stored in memory, refining his internal model of the farm as if it were a living equation. The wooden plow did not disappear, but its role evolved. It was no longer just a symbol of resistance. It became a tool within a more adaptive system, one that could bend without breaking. Samuel was not abandoning his philosophy, but he was reshaping it, testing whether its core could survive in a world that no longer moved at the pace it once did. By 1970, the results of those subtle changes began to surface. His yields recovered, not dramatically, but steadily, climbing back within 5% of their historical range despite ongoing instability in weather and prices. More importantly, his costs remained controlled. his dependence on external inputs still minimal. While others oscillated between profit and loss, Samuel returned to something resembling balance. Yet the question that had emerged in 1968 did not disappear. It lingered, quieter now but deeper, like a crack beneath the surface that could widen under the right pressure. How long could a system built on patience and control continue to adapt before it reached a limit that no amount of adjustment could overcome? The turning point did not arrive with thunder or spectacle, but with a quiet collapse elsewhere that echoed louder than any storm. In the summer of 1973, a surge in global demand drove wheat prices sharply upward, climbing past $2.50 per bushel in a matter of months. For many farmers, it felt like redemption. They expanded aggressively, pushing every available acre into production, investing further in machinery to capitalize on the boom. Fields that had once been allowed to rest were forced back into rotation. Fertilizers were applied in heavier doses, and the pace of farming accelerated to match the market's sudden hunger. Samuel did not follow. On his now 360-acre farm, he maintained his rotations, leaving nearly 20% of his land fallow even as prices peaked. To outsiders, it looked like a refusal to seize opportunity, almost an act of quiet self-sabotage. Neighbors calculated the revenue he was losing, estimating that he was walking away from tens of thousands of dollars in a single season. Some confronted him directly, frustration replacing curiosity, as if his restraint somehow challenged their urgency. But Samuel had seen cycles before, smaller ones, less dramatic, yet governed by the same underlying rhythm. He understood that markets, like soil, could be overworked. The more aggressively they were pushed, the more violently they could correct. His decision was not about missing profit, but about avoiding exposure. That exposure revealed itself sooner than anyone expected. By late 1974, prices began to fall, first gradually, then with increasing speed. Within a year, wheat dropped below $1.80 per bushel, and the expanded operations that had seemed brilliant months earlier became liabilities. Farmers who had borrowed to scale up found themselves locked into higher costs with shrinking returns. Equipment payments remained fixed. Input prices did not fall as quickly as crop prices. Margins compressed, then vanished. Samuel's position, by contrast, held steady. His lower input costs, diversified rotation, and preserved soil structure allowed him to maintain profitability even as others slipped into loss. More importantly, his restraint during the peak meant he carried no additional debt into the downturn. While others were forced to sell portions of their land to stay afloat, Samuel began purchasing again, slowly, carefully, adding another 70 acres over the next 3 years, bringing his total to over 430 acres by 1977. The wooden plow, still in use, had become something almost mythic among those who paid attention. It represented not just a method, but a discipline, a refusal to be pulled by every external force. The brass pocket watch, now worn thin at the edges, continued its steady ticking, marking not just time but distance, the widening gap between Samuel's approach and the mainstream system. By the end of the decade, something remarkable had taken shape. Samuel's farm was no longer just stable. It was quietly dominant in its own way. His annual net income, once modest, had grown consistently, reaching levels that few would have predicted for a farmer who refused modern machinery. By 1979, his operation was generating close to $300,000 a year in profit, not through explosive growth, but through compounding advantages built over decades. And yet, the most surprising shift was not financial. It was perceptual. The same farmers who had once dismissed him now studied him, not openly, but through observation, through small changes in their own practices that mirrored his in fragments. They reduced tillage in certain fields. They experimented with rotations. They questioned quietly the assumption that speed and scale were always superior. Samuel never declared victory. He never framed his approach as a solution for everyone. He simply continued, season after season, guided by the same principles that had once isolated him. But now those principles carried a different weight, no longer dismissed as outdated, but recognized, however reluctantly, as something that had endured where others had not. Still, even as his system proved itself against cycles of boom and bust, a deeper question began to form, one that reached beyond profit, beyond survival, into something more enduring. If a method built on patience could outlast decades of change, what would it become when passed to a world that no longer remembered how to wait? By the early 1980s, the land no longer argued with Samuel Carter, it answered him. His farm, now approaching 520 acres, had become a layered system where each acre carried memory, each decision echoing across seasons with a kind of quiet precision. The broader agricultural economy, however, had entered one of its harshest periods. Interest rates climbed into double digits, some exceeding 15%, and land values, once inflated by years of optimism, began to fall. Farmers who had expanded aggressively in the previous decade found themselves trapped between declining asset values and rising debt costs. Foreclosures became more common than harvest celebrations, and auctions replaced the steady rhythm of planting cycles. Samuel moved through this period with the same measured pace that had defined his entire life, but now that pace revealed its true power. His minimal reliance on loans insulated him from rising interest rates. His diversified rotation reduced exposure to any single market collapse. His soil, built carefully over decades, required fewer external inputs even as prices for fertilizers and fuel climbed. Where others faced a tightening spiral, Samuel operated within a system that absorbed pressure rather than amplifying it. The brass pocket watch, now nearly smooth from years of handling, had become less of an object and more of a philosophy carried in metal. It marked not just time, but discipline, the ability to resist urgency when urgency was driven by fear rather than necessity. Samuel no longer needed to check it often. Its lesson had already been absorbed. In 1984, a younger farmer named Daniel Hayes, recently returned from agricultural college, arrived at Samuel's farm not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. His family's 600-acre operation, heavily mechanized and financed, was on the edge of collapse. He had been taught efficiency, scale, optimization, all the language of modern farming, yet none of it had prepared him for a system that could fail so quickly under pressure. What he found on Samuel's land did not match what he had learned, and that mismatch forced him to ask a different kind of question. Samuel did not offer instructions in the way Daniel expected. Instead, he walked him through the fields, pointing to differences that were easy to overlook: soil that held together instead of breaking apart, water that lingered instead of running off, crops that varied slightly in height but remained consistently healthy. He explained rotation not as a rule but as a conversation, a way of listening to what the land needed rather than imposing what the market demanded. The wooden plow, still in use, became a focal point of that lesson, not because it was superior in all situations, but because it required attention, and attention created understanding. Over the next 3 years, Daniel began to adapt parts of Samuel's system, not by abandoning machinery entirely, but by reducing dependence on it, integrating principles that prioritized soil health, cost control, and long-term stability. His results did not transform overnight, but they stabilized. Losses slowed, then stopped, then gradually turned into modest gains. What had seemed outdated revealed itself as adaptable, not fixed in the past, but anchored in fundamentals that could survive change. By 1987, Samuel's annual net income crossed $3 million, a figure that seemed almost impossible when viewed through the lens of his methods alone. It was not driven by a single breakthrough, but by decades of compounding decisions, land acquired at the right moments, costs avoided when others accepted them, and yields that, while never extreme, remained consistently reliable. He had built not just a farm, but a system that generated advantage over time, quietly, steadily, without spectacle. As Samuel entered his 70s, his presence on the farm shifted. He worked less in terms of physical labor, but more in observation, guiding decisions, maintaining the patterns he had spent a lifetime understanding. The pocket watch passed into Daniel's hands one autumn afternoon, not as an inheritance of ownership, but as an inheritance of perspective. Time, Samuel explained, was not something to control, but something to align with, to respect, to let compound in your favor rather than against you. When Samuel Carter passed away in 1991, there were no grand declarations attached to his name, no widespread recognition beyond the county that had once questioned him. Yet his legacy had already taken root in ways that extended beyond a single farm. Fields managed with greater restraint, farmers thinking in longer horizons, decisions made with an awareness of consequence rather than convenience. His methods did not replace modern agriculture, but they reshaped how some chose to exist within it. The wooden plow remained in the barn, no longer used daily but never discarded. It stood as a reminder that progress was not always forward in the way it appeared, that sometimes the most advanced position was the one that understood what not to change. And somewhere, in the quiet rhythm of fields turning through seasons, the question that had followed Samuel for decades found its answer, not in words, but in outcomes that spoke across time.